over the last, I would almost say 20 years that I've been involved in the industry, we've watched different stages of things of trying to see timing on fungicide applications and, what kind of responses we're seeing on things.
What I've seen early on in my career with fungicides is it was almost always a reactive management decision.
Over the years, they've had a lot of good information tied to where, especially from a return on investment standpoint, that time frame from tassel to kind of R1 is areas where they found probably the biggest, most consistent return on investment for that fungicide spraying.
Back when I began, we didn't have much corn around here, it was milo, but over time, fungicides have evolved to where we're looking at them not just necessarily from a disease protection standpoint or a curative, but also a preventative, and then to your point, from a plant health aspect. Today's fungicides are drastically different than the ones that we were using 20 years ago, and so they drastically improve plant health. Maybe don't necessarily benefit quite as much as some of the fuller season corns. Fungicides are drastically, as I said earlier, different than they were 15 or 20 years ago.
Dollars and data on Cam Seeds Radio.
Welcome back to Dirt Dollars and Data, and today we're talking about one of the big management decisions in corn production every year, what I call the tassel spray. Should you spray fungicide? When should you spray? What products should you use? What diseases do we actually target? What products should also be in the tank with it? And really, the most important question is, does it pay? Does it actually make you money? How important is it to corn production? And joining me today is Brooke Mitchell. He's the technical agronomist for Channel, and appreciate you joining today, Brooke.
Thanks for having me.
So, Brooke, tell us just a little bit about your background. Tell us about your role with Channel and the geographies that you're working.
Yeah, so Channel technical agronomist. So my role on the Channel side is we're doing a lot of product selection in our area. So I'm very heavily involved on following the products, making sure we're getting really good placement on products across the area. So working with seed pros like yourself in those areas, but at the same time also giving that technical advice of how to place those products, on things like fungicide. What kind of responses are we seeing with the products across the area? And so that's really been a big area of emphasis for me, is watching those products, right? And especially for the Southeast Kansas, Southwest Missouri area. This has been an area that I grew up in Southeast Kansas with it. And so I've had a lot of pride being down here and being involved with this. And like I said, I've been down back in this area since 2015 to this area, seen a lot of the ground and challenges that we come across in Southeast Kansas, Southwest Missouri area. But the area that I actually cover now is you kind of get that 54 corridor highway in Southeast Kansas. So everything from there south, then kind of get up into that Missouri area, be that Adrian, Missouri area, Amsterdam, and then south there all the way down into the Springfield area. So get to see quite a bit of different area.
Pretty good geography.
Yeah.
Well, I've always enjoyed working together with you over the years. We've had the opportunity to work together on different levels, and I've always appreciated your perspective and your knowledge. And so really glad that you're here today. And let's just go ahead and get started in this whole tassel spray game. And let's just start with the obvious question. Why do farmers make a fungicide application at tassel in the first place?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's definitely over the last, I would almost say 20 years that I've been involved in the industry. We've watched different stages of things of trying to see timing on fungicide applications and, what kind of responses we're seeing on things. And over the years, they've had a lot of good information tied to where, especially from a return on investment standpoint, that time frame from tassel to kind of R1 is areas where they've found probably the biggest, most consistent return on investment for that fungicide spraying. And so as we're getting close to that tassel period, that's where we're starting to look into those aspects of, okay, what kind of disease pressures could we be facing out there? And does that change up our mix a little bit of what we're looking after behind there? But a lot of things just happens during that phase with it. And I think even from an applicator standpoint, with the amount of acres that come in there, it can be very pressure sensitive of trying to get out there in a timely fashion with it. And so usually that's always been that big key is we start seeing the tassel time hit in, it's time to start getting some things done out there.
Yeah, so I guess from the perspective of spraying at tassel, what are we actually doing though? I mean, what are we targeting?
Yeah.
What diseases are most common in our geography? And from your perspective, is there a disease or are there diseases that are costing the most yield?
Yeah. So definitely in our area, things that I have seen a lot of acres, even on rotated acres, especially since we're doing a lot more of the no-till aspects. We're leaving a lot more of the residue out there. Gray leaf spot, first and foremost. It's one that, in all honesty, I think people maybe underestimate that one a little bit, especially because they're like, oh, I'm rotating this from soybeans. We should be fine. Well, that residue's sitting out there. It's amazed with the humidity that we have, the rainfall that we have, the amount of gray leaf spot that can actually start moving up fairly early on out there. And so that's one I'm always looking for out there. And I always tell growers to be getting out there scouting, see if it's already starting to move up in that canopy, because some hybrids are a little more sensitive to it than others, from that aspect. Another one that it's probably more of, let's see what's happening to the south as the weather approaches. But southern rust, that's one that to me is probably the biggest detriment when it shows up. Because when it hits, it acts fast and it hits the plant very fast with it. And so it's one that I'm constantly watching what's happening to the south from a weather standpoint, because it doesn't overwinter here. It's down south. Sometimes it can overwinter in that South Texas, but it's even can be in that Caribbean area where it kind of overwinters that tropical, subtropical area. And so we need moisture and some of those Gulf moisture events to start bringing up those spores to us. And so when we start seeing indicators of like Texas, right? If they're starting to see things, we're going to start watching that weather pattern pretty closely. Because if we start, especially like hurricane fronts, I've watched that over the years. You get those hurricane fronts that come in through the Gulf, they'll blow that moisture and that blows those spores right up into our area. And they can move fairly rapid by doing that. So those two are probably the first and foremost that I'm always watching for out there. What I'd say is probably a little bit of a secondary one would be like anthracnose. We're dealing with wet soils usually early on in the growing season, which congratulations this year.
Yes, exactly.
It happened, right? It can set the stage for anthracnose to show up with it. And that has a little bit of determinant of late season stress that happens that really triggers that out there. But because of that, and let's say if the plant's not necessarily as healthy as it wants to be, then we can start seeing some stalk degradation that happens out there and stalk lodging in it. And there are things about fungicides that can help some of that aspect, which, a lot of times we're just always talking about taking care of what's right then and there, or what's coming a little bit from, again, a southern rust or gray leaves. But I think in some ways we kind of forget about that plant health aspect that actually sits in the fungicide category. That to me, it's hard to put an ROI to it a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's definitely there, especially with, again, the rain events that we get and the stress that we can put on some things in southeast Kansas, southwest Missouri.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, because over my career, what I've seen early on in my career with fungicides is it was almost always a reactive management decision. So to your point with southern rust, if it was blowing in, then folks would go spray. Of course, back when I began, we didn't have much corn around here. It was milo. But over time, fungicides have evolved to where we're looking at them not just necessarily from a disease protection standpoint or a curative, but also preventative. And then to your point, from a plant health aspect, you know, today's fungicides are drastically different than the ones that we were using 20 years ago. And so they drastically improve plant health. And, you know, that's a topic that we can get into here in just a few minutes. But something else that I want to hit on while we're on this subject is when we talk about the weather, are there weather conditions? You know, you just talked about southern rust blowing in. But for some of these other diseases, are there weather conditions that are more favorable for disease development?
Yeah. So, again, like gray leaf spot's a good one, right? It likes that warm, humid environment. So as we're looking at fields, for instance, irrigation, that's a great one to watch gray leaf spot on, because we're already naturally putting a bunch of moisture out there with the irrigation. And in that canopy, like I said, it seems like you're just increasing that humidity levels that are in there. Mm-hmm. And that gray leaf spot loves that, right? And anthracnose, again, you're kind of dealing with an early, I'm going to say wet period, followed by some later heat stresses that actually just kind of kick that one in gear a little bit. Northern four-leaf blight is probably one that shows up, but probably doesn't necessarily hit us very hard. It usually kind of likes that cooler environment that a lot of our nighttime heats really knock out more times than not. It doesn't mean that you can't see it out there. I've seen it definitely at times, but it's usually not one that gets really high on my radar just because of some of the nighttime heats that we deal with through here. You know, one that is at least getting looked at probably even closer is probably tar spot. That's a unique one that right now, luckily, we have not had to face. And I think I've seen some areas where probably that, I want to tell you that Harrisonville, Missouri kind of area is kind of probably that southern movement so far. A lot sits in that I-70 corridor, but it's like eating milder temperatures. Again, moisture is a good thing for it, but it likes having those milder temperatures, which in all honesty, I think is why we haven't seen it advance south. It seems like to me, you kind of get that east of I-35, south of I-70 corridor. I'm in Kansas, and like I said, I used to cover all of Kansas at one time as an agronomist. Mm-hmm. You get into that corridor, our nighttime heat picks up through here, and it does a lot of different things. And so, especially for like tar spot, it does not like that high nighttime heat temperatures. And again, things will be developed as they keep looking at it in more aspects of it. But I think that is one that's helped us, because that is a very aggressive one as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad we have not had to face it here. Unfortunately, I've had counterparts to the north that last year they had tar spot on things and southern rust on things. And that's to me is almost a knockout punch a little bit. Yeah. When you get both of those.
Knockout punch for yield. For sure.
Absolutely. But yeah, so definitely watching some of those weather patterns can help dictate a little bit of what you should be watching for, and probably even in some ways of what kind of pressures you might end up seeing, right? Because just like you're saying, we'd like to be more preventative as best we can than probably reactive to it. Mm-hmm. And so try to look ahead a little bit from that application and go, okay, if I'm going to get 21 days of protection, what am I protecting with? You know, and what are we possibly going to face during that period? Out there.
So in talking about all this, it just made me think of something, and it's kind of a basic question, but what should growers be looking for? Okay, so what if a grower is going to go out and scout his field, just give us some basic guidelines of what to be looking for.
Yeah. So gray leaf spot, a good way to look for that, of course, is look in that lower canopy on it. Now, especially in those upper leaves, you'll see that what I almost call like a brown, thin horizontal lesion that'll start developing. And like I said, over time, it just slowly progresses up that canopy. And the big part about having that, again, the tassel time frame of things is trying to protect that ear leaf and above canopy, right? 'Cause that's our big energy sink that ends up getting most of our sunlight, puts everything, that energy into the ears. So it's kind of protecting those aspects of it. The, southern rust side of things, especially if you think maybe it's already have come in, right? What you want to be looking for there is looking in the upper canopy. You'll typically see it up in that upper regions. You'll end up having almost like an orange dust feel, especially if it's a very active southern rust that you're working with. And from that, as it develops, just kind of explodes down into that plant structure. So again, as we look at it from a fungicide application, right, we're trying to protect that upper canopy again from any development that could develop through there with it. Anthracnose, you're really watching, to me, you're almost watching a little bit more of the stock side of things, where you almost get like almost say like a black, it almost looks like a bruise mark, but it's really not. And again, it's lesions that start developing, and it can develop in that upper quadrant of the stalk on things. And again, those are things we're kind of keeping an eye out for, because again, we're wanting green, healthy tissue out there for it. And those are, again, as those of the main ones that I'm looking for, that's what I'm looking for.
Okay, that's good information. So let's move on now just a little bit and set the disease side, or the disease piece aside for just a minute. And let's talk about a question that I get in almost every single conversation when it comes to the tassel spray, and that's timing.
Yeah.
So corn is starting to tassel. How early is too early? How late is too late? When do you get the best return on investment? So talk to us about timing.
Yeah. And I do think even timing wise, it probably has a little bit, again, of what you're expecting from a little bit of a disease pressure standpoint. We'll kind of toss out an example here. Let's say we're seeing some gray leaf spot moving up in that plant. Again, if I'm looking at tassel R1, I'm definitely looking at that time frame to try to protect, because I don't want that gray leaf spot moving up higher in that plant at all behind there. But let's just say, for instance, we're getting the tassel time frame. We're not having much pressure down below, but there's chance right now that there's some of that southern rust movement's coming in, right? One thing that I look at there is I might actually push a little bit to brown silk, because I want to be able to extend out my coverage through that grain fill period. With that being said, I would always rather caution to be on the early side, especially with a lot of the chemistry that we're running, where again, we're getting a lot of preventative measure there, than to be on the late side. I've seen that before too, where guys have waited, and again, especially with southern rust or something that would show up, and they're already a week behind. Now we've already had something, and by the time you're seeing it, it's already been in that plant for a week, right? But as I kind of look at it, if I'm getting in general a one-time spray, and let's say I'm probably getting to that, let's say an R3 stage, and I still haven't pulled the trigger, I might be getting too late, personally, from a true return on the investment at that point. But definitely, to me, I'm definitely targeting the tassel. I'd probably rather not be out there before that, especially in some of these dryland acres that we work with in there with it. But then that rest of that timing piece kind of dictates on what we're working with and what's coming or not coming a little bit, if that makes sense, on it. But that's always been a great question, because again, you would love to say there's a magic bullet that then boom, this is what we do every time, don't even think about it, because it just works. It's not necessarily the case. But in general, I feel like tassel, if you're going to plan for it and you can talk to your applicator or whoever, at least baseline in that tassel time frame, to me is a great time, because to me, you're not too early and you're still getting some of that coverage that you're needing to. You're still getting some plant health aspects out of it. But then, like I said, that latter part of what I would say, if we get into that R3 stage, we've probably missed a big point of return.
Yeah.
If that, again, hopefully that answers what you're.
Oh, I think it does. You know, I guess the only additional question I'd have about that, you know, if somebody's listening is, and they're trying to figure out that timing aspect, a question that I get a lot: 25% tassel, 50%, 75%. Wait until it's 100%. Wait for a week after it's 100%. Give us some basic guidelines around those parameters.
Yeah. So for me, I would really, really like to see a full tassel out there to get the application at that point. Because again, a lot of things are dealt with getting that preventative long term as best we can. Again, it's not to say that if we hit 50%, are we hurting anything? Probably not necessarily, right? But it's definitely a period where that's what I'm trying to shoot for. Best case scenario with it. And I think sometimes too, the big challenge, I will take that back. Probably some of the big challenge of it is dealing with how quickly can you get it applied. That might be another way that you have to look at that a little bit is, okay, if I'm needing to call my applicator guy and he wants to know, is it 50% tacit so he can get out there in a timely fashion.
Yeah.
That's probably something that needs to be discussed, right? Or is it a deal of, I need to get a hold of my applicator when I'm one leaf away from tassel so they can get it in a somewhat timely fashion? Because that's definitely in our area, it's becoming a bigger and bigger thing to get a lot more, acres that are getting covered more than what it has in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So it puts a lot of pressure on the applicators there, which puts some pressure on from a timing standpoint behind there. So that, I guess that might be the aspect too, is probably want to visit with your applicator to know, okay, if I say we're good to go, are we looking a week out, or are you needing a 2-week advance on this deal behind there?
So ideally, you like to see 100% tassel, and then once we get up to about R3, you're saying by that time you're starting to really get too late to be cost effective.
To really see that bigger, what I want to call ROI side of it with it. And now I will preface that with, let's say, and I've seen this happen before, is you do that tassel application, or let's say even a brown silk application, and we see even some extreme heavy pressures.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen where from that, let's say R3 period, that we're coming back in with a follow-up because it's heavy enough pressure, especially irrigated acres. Again, where you got some real high yield that you're trying to protect, that can be a caveat there, right? That, okay, something from R3 on can be helpful, but if it's your main one shot, we need to be ahead of that to see that return.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's move into a different segment of this conversation now, and let's talk about the fungicides. We mentioned a couple of times throughout the conversation so far, we've talked about preventative and curative and whatnot. Fungicides are drastically, as I said earlier, different than they were 15 or 20 years ago. So talk to us just for a couple of minutes about the different classes of fungicides, mm-hmm. and some of the things that you've seen there.
Yeah. So for me, as I'm looking at things, we've got about 3 main classes that we work with. We've got your DMIs, or your what I call trizol group. We've got the QIs, or what I call a strobilurin group. And then you got the SDHIs group. Those 3 all have different plays on it. So as we're looking at DMIs, or the trizols, those are truly that curative group that's out there. They're the ones that are, especially if we've got some disease present, are stopping what's trying to keep growing and try to reproduce on that plant. So they're very important from the curative aspect, but they're also very important to tie in with whether it's an SDHI or the strobilurins. To me, I would never, ever go out with just a strobe by itself. I know we're doing preventative work that's out there, but that triazole is going to help us with what's potentially out there. But the biggest aspect of it as well is, especially with southern rust, is trying to limit resistance out there. Because strobilurins are good from a preventative standpoint, but they have shown they've got potential for some resistant buildup. But same as SDHIs, they've got potential sitting there as well, to where you're kind of needing to tag team those together. Because just going out purely with a curative, well, you're not going to get your long-term, coverage from anything else that's moving in right behind there. And so, to me, and again, probably depends on the pressure levels that are out there. But first and foremost, if I'm looking at something, the triazole, strobilurins, first and foremost, we need to have those in there. We need to have them together. Probably the next step up would be adding the SDHIs. They add, to me, it's kind of like, it's almost a bridge between the strobilurins and the triazoles. Is it ends up, there's a little bit of curative, but it's kind of bridging things together to where you're getting a longer residual, when I want to say a higher concentration residual, longer term behind those. And it's been very unique watching some of those develop. I know, like our Delara Complete, at our Richards research site just north of Nevada, they've done trials with that Delara Complete last, 5 years actually on that. And to be able to see some of the activity that's been able to do, especially from a late plant health standpoint, it's been tremendous to watch those out there. But I guess that, and let me kind of walk back here a little bit. So, we visit about plant health a little bit, and that's really where the strobilurins and the SDHIs come in, is they're giving us that plant health benefit out there. They're helping us, one, keeping things greener, healthier, but they actually end up even helping how that plant acts during stress with it. And with a lot of the genetics anymore, and even our Richards research site would show this, even under low pressure situations, we've had some very good yield responses by having this combination in there. And I think a lot of it has to do with how much weight we're adding to that ear during grain fill. And the longer we can keep that natural grain fill process going and not shutting things down early, we're actually getting some very good yield responses without having disease pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's a huge piece for us.
Well, and that goes back to a point I was trying to make earlier, where 15 or 20 years ago, the fungicides were more strictly about disease, and now with the advent of all of these new fungicides and SDHIs, we're seeing so many more plant health benefits. So regardless of whether you think southern rust is going to blow in or not, spraying a fungicide can still offer a return on investment from the plant health aspect. So, when I look at that, one of the things we used to say, I remember when SDHIs first came out, we used to say that the SDHIs almost had a steroid-like effect on the plant. Talk to us about that for just a minute.
So on the SDHI aspect of it, again, it's about relieving that stress in that plant, right? And how that process works on it, it's especially with our nighttime heats that we're dealing with. To me, it's kind of like, having someone run a race. That is SDHI is helping that plant kind of calm itself back down to where it's not burning those sugars as hard as it has behind there. And by doing that, again, it kind of extends out that, I almost want to call it it's not necessarily a drought stress period that we run into, but again, it's that heat stress period that we deal with down here that, again, it's allowing that plant to be happy for let's just say it's a couple extra days. Sometimes for our area, those couple extra days ends up being finally we get that rain event that allows that plant to finally get true relief. Versus if we didn't have that in there, that plant's running that race, it never gets that moment to pause, to catch its breath for a little bit. I mean, again, it's not the best technical term, the way that I look at it, but it's the aspect of how that kind of functions in there. Because there's definitely aspects of that chemistry that is definitely helping how that plant handles those situations better than it would without it.
Excuse me.
That makes a lot of sense. So as we talk about that now, the question in my mind becomes, can a product like Quilt XL still get the job done? Or do we really need an SDHI in there?
Yeah, so, I think it has a lot to do with, again, kind of looking at what's some of my yield potential that I'm trying to protect a little bit, right? And then also very well could be looking at some of your budgets a little bit and, what can we do from a budget standpoint? If we've got a little more room in the budget, to me, I would always say move up and grab the SCHI. But let's just say, for instance, we're in some situations where maybe the yield potential, it isn't 150 bushel environment or 170 bushel environment. And maybe we're a little lower on the gray leaf spot pressure. It's not building up as hard. A Quilt XL or like a Delaro, those can be utilized in those situations, right? Just knowing that you're not going to get probably that longer term plant health aspect of it. But I think everybody's got to kind of balance that a little bit. Like I said, I don't think it's let's do this across every acre concept. It's let's find some of those fields, right? Again, I guess if I kind of balance it out a little bit, is which ones have got some better yield potential, whether it's some of the bottoms ground that we're dealing with, whether it's irrigated acres that we're dealing with on it. But again, what kind of disease pressures are we seeing? Is it a heavy residue, acre that we're working with, or is it been some clean tilled? That can make a difference on maybe how you position some of those products. Because I do think, again, something that's just a triazole strobe has a place out there. With that being said, I do think that products with the SDHI are extra. To me, there's extra benefit there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's been a big thing that I've watched over the years. And even as I, worked a handful of years ago looking at products for another company down in Texas, it's amazing what heat stress can do to a plant, to me. But with the nighttime heats, again, we can just do a lot of things to corn down here that other areas don't ever see.
Yeah,
on it.
Absolutely.
And again, I love to go after just the disease aspect of it. But again, if I can keep that plant healthier longer out there, we're going to be in a much better situation. Again, especially with the genetics that have developed over the 20 years that I've been working, it's just amazed how much gets pumped into that ear weight-wise. Mm-hmm. We used to think, man, if we got a point, 4 or 5 pound ear, it was amazing. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, some of the work that I've been working with, I've got some that'll push over 0.6 pound ears.
Yeah.
But it's all about how long can I have that grain fill process in there out of it. And that weight adds up in a hurry to me.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So in talking about all these fungicides, another thing that comes to mind is there something else that should be in the tank? So like from an adjuvant standpoint, if we're flying it on, if we're spraying, what should we, if anything, consider adding to the tank? So things like stickers, as people call them, stickers, mm-hmm. canopy penetrants. Are there situations where they help? Do they hurt? Tell us what you've seen over time.
So definitely, as we're looking at, and it seems like a lot's done aerially applied more times than not. Mm-hmm. Deposition agents would be first and foremost added to the tank. It's all about trying to get it penetrated down to that canopy. And if we can get to that mid canopy early, we want it down there. And I think there's been plenty of research and data behind things that shows that those deposition agents help get that down there, with it. So I wouldn't do anything with a fungicide without doing that, especially from an aerial application standpoint. Now, from a, let's say, non-ionic surfactant standpoint or a crop oil standpoint, that's something definitely from any applications from V8 to the tassel time, right? We don't want any in there. That's been kind of, I know it's probably developed probably in the last 10 years of looking at the data side of it, that there can be adverse effects by doing it. And it's just has a lot to do with that plant's, setting up a reproductive process, and any added stress, that hormone aspect can cause some abnormalities. And we've seen it in like arrested ear development. And they've definitely seen where like NIS has that, it can have an effect on the hormone aspect of it. So those are ones where, for me, we definitely get past tassel. I would prefer that the adjuvants like NIS wait for brown silk. Personally, I think that's a safe scenario there to where you've kind of taken care of some of the aspects. I mean, again, you want to follow labels as best possible on them, because they're going to dictate what they've got. And most of them will say like V8 to VT, which so R1, we're silking. There's probably still some aspect there of we're silking, we're pollinating, we're doing some things right then and there, versus brown silk, we're done with pollination. We can add some of those things back in there, because they do help. They actually help with that spreading of the chemistry across that leaf. So there's reasons we want them, but there's periods when we probably don't want them in there because they're going to cause some issues with it.
And that's been my experiences too. I remember back, as you said, 10, 15 years ago, it was more commonplace to put some of those things in. And over time, we learned that sometimes they have a detrimental effect. And I would encourage everybody to read the label, because a lot of the labels of these newer fungicides talk about adjuvants and some of the things that you should or should not have in the tank. So I would encourage you to do that. Another thing, when we start talking about adding things into the tank, one of the other things that comes to mind are things like micronutrients, foliar nutrition. So talk to us a little bit about what you've seen there. Is it necessary? Maybe talk through just a little bit about some of the deficiencies from a micro standpoint that you could be seeing around that tassel time.
Yeah.
And is it beneficial to add those?
Yeah. So the ones that I have probably noticed more times than not, and it's maybe not that you're seeing it at tassel, but it seems to me like there's a higher chance that you're going to see them maybe just a little later on. Nitrogen, first and foremost, especially in our area with the wet springs that we get, even through the growing season, the wet saturated soils we get. Probably our biggest factor that we have from a fertility standpoint is getting enough nitrogen to the plant through the grain fill period out there. Unfortunately, we lose a lot that denitrifies when we get saturated soils out there. And so nitrogen from a foliar standpoint, especially a tassel time frame, I'm a big proponent of out there. It's, again, is it going to be perfect? Is it going to take care of that, 60, 70 pounds that we might have lost? No. But it is supplementing and helping us try to get through another phase of it. Because there's plenty of times, even under high yield situations, when growers have thought they've put plenty of nitrogen up front, we'll see it late season, halfway up the plant, we've already fired, right, on things. And so that one is a big one that I look at. That, again, from a planning standpoint, if you can plan for that to be a part of that application, into your budget, I'm a proponent of that. Absolutely. The other one that will show itself up more times than not, potassium. Now, Drain wise, the grain's only taking in like 30, let's say 35, maybe 40% of the actual potassium goes into the grain, where it's a lot higher from a nitrogen standpoint. But that potassium is very important from a stress standpoint in that plant and how it regulates and moves the nutrients through that plant.
So,
And if we get to that grain fill period, and let's say we're lacking it, one, it'll pull from the leaves really hard, but it'll start pulling from the stalk. And that's when the things start showing themselves. When it starts pulling on that stalk, now we're opening ourselves up for stalk rats to start to develop as well on things and to prematurely shut down that plant with it. And that's one that I have seen time and time again as well. Like I said, when you go out and you start to check ears for development and you look down and you're seeing that outer midrib of that leaf vein, and we're already a quarter way up the plant.
It's having an effect. Yeah, you're not maximizing yield. Absolutely.
So those are two first and foremost that I'm very mindful of watching. If we can supplement, we're going to be in a much better position. Again, especially the higher the yield that we're pushing, the more we're asking that ground to do some things for us. Other ones that I've definitely seen at times can be sulfur. Sulfur is another one that can show itself up. It's very mobile in the ground. So if we get a lot of groundwater, we're moving a lot of groundwater on things, we can end up seeing that one show up. And then that one's very detrimental how nitrogen gets utilized in the plant as well behind there. So, I mean, those are probably the three that I probably watch more than anything and probably look at if I'm going to do some supplementation. Those are three real easy ones to be looking at least from my perspective. And I 100% confident in the companies of what they've got. I mean, visit with your company providers about what's safe to have in with the chemistries on things. Because again, we don't want any burn. Yeah. That's a big thing. But I've seen a lot of good things from those.
And I think you make a really good point, because there's so many products out there. People ask me all the time about nutritionals and foliar feeds and whatnot. There are so many products out there these days, and you can accomplish about anything you want to accomplish. If you lack nitrogen, boron, I mean, any kind of deficiency, there's a product for it. The problem is how will it affect the crop? What kind of crop response will there be? Can you mix it with this? Can you mix it with that? So there's so many variables there. And I think you made a good point. Talk to somebody that you routinely work with about what you can and can't do when it comes to those products. So as we move on, let's get to really what I call the $1 million question. Is there a return on investment? There's a lot of money that's spent when you're talking about flying this stuff on, potentially adding foliar products. You start talking about the SDHI fungicides. Those are all pretty expensive. So, in this environment, what kind of yield responses, let me position it like that, what kind of yield responses, because everybody can do the math, what kind of yield responses are you typically seeing when you apply a fungicide at tassel?
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of relate back to what I kind of mentioned earlier on is our Bayer research site at Richards. It's a really good location. Our team does a really good job there, just north of Nevada is our area. But we've been able to, one, look at a lot of our different hybrids out there. But from that aspect, being able to do, since 2021, do fungicide response by hybrid, but do it in replicated plots aspects. So we can kind of get a true representation of what's happening, get from a given year. That was the big concept when they started that, is to see, especially over multiple years, what kind of responses are we going to see out of this? And I'll premise that ground, that typically that ground can be some 200 bushel ground, but it also can be some 100 bushel, depending on the years on it. Can be a lot of 150, 160. So it matches a lot of things that we see across our area from a yield perspective. But in general, since 2021, when they run the products through, again, the multiple hybrids that we run them across, they were seeing an average response around 11.4 bushel. And to me, that's averaging, like I said, let's say, I think it was 2022. That year was a little tougher. Let's say non-treated was averaging around 95 bushel. Well, they still had a response right at 100 bushel. So almost a 5 bushel response in a low yielding environment that year, right? On things. But in general, over those periods of seeing more like 150s and 170s and 180s, they're seeing that average around 11.5 bushel in our area. So it's not like you're grabbing stuff from north of I-70 and we're pushing 300 bushels consistently on some things. So to me, that's a very good sign that there's ROI there. Now, again, that has to come back to the math a little bit on things behind there, but that's some yield response. And I would tell you, 3 out of those 5 years were low disease years, mind you.
That's interesting.
So when you look at that, again, I think that has a lot to do with coming back to that plant health aspect personally of it, that it's not just on high disease years that you're going to see ROI. You can see it on average years upon things. And to me, fungicide is not a guarantee, right? No one's probably ever going to give you a guarantee, but I kind of treat it like an insurance policy in my mind. Is you're going to have years you're going to get a certain response. It might only be, a couple bushels for whatever reason Mother Nature does, but then there's going to be those years that you've got better responses. And look at that long-term average trend across there. And to me, when I'm seeing 11.5 bushel across this wide range of yield environments that we dealt with each year, that tells me we've got some good possibilities out there. What we're seeing with the genetics on top of it.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Over time, what I've seen, and let's just talk about this before we move on. What I've seen is that some of the shorter season corns maybe don't necessarily benefit quite as much as some of the fuller season corns. So again, that's been over the course of my career, but talk to me about what you've seen there.
Yeah, so it's a good question there too, and thought process behind it. I mean, we definitely typically see some longer grain fill periods out of some of those longer maturities, which again makes sense behind, again, keeping the plant healthy. We should have more yield potential sitting there if everything else is equal on it. But I will say, like one of our products, 204-54, it's 104 day. It's ended up averaging almost, I think, 18 or 19 bushel response.
Yeah,
believe it or not. So it's a short season product, but it's still seeing some advantages by doing it. And so I'm never going to say it's spot short season. You're not going to see as big of a benefit long season. But in generalities, you should expect probably more times than not the longer season because you've got more yield potential to protect. And again, I think that's a big thing there, right? Is no matter what we're doing with the fungicides, it's not that we're adding bushels, it's we're protecting bushels out there.
I think that's a good point. Is fungicide at tassel more about protecting the yield, or is it more about increasing the yield?
Yeah, and it's protecting. Absolutely, 100%. Because it's every little thing that we add a stress to the plant, we're pulling yield at that point. And that's really, to me, it's bridging that gap of trying to stop that aspect from happening any faster than what we normally want to see it. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you what I consider to be a tough question, as obviously it's mostly growers listening to this podcast. So if you were spending your own money and you only had enough money to, say, pay for half of your acres, how would you decide which fields get sprayed and which ones don't?
Yeah. Now, that is an honest question because it gets asked all the time. I mean, to me, again, it's a multiple step look. And again, I wish I would say this is the easy answer, but I would first go to, again, fields that you felt like have the higher yield potentials would be my start right away. Because again, by doing that, we've probably got a better chance of the ROI aspect of it. But also look at the environment that it's sitting in. You know, are we in, again, irrigated ground versus some dryland acres? Well, I'm probably going to zone in on my irrigated acres, right? Because we got more moisture there, more humidity. But I think also from a dryland standpoint, I can look at some of our lower lying acres. They're on some fairly decent little bottom ground. They're holding moisture. They're going to have higher humidities. There's a better chance for more disease to arise there behind it. But on top of that, I would even say hybrids as well. So let's just say if all's equal on it, start looking and visit with your seed pro, for instance, right? And ask them, okay, I've got 21560 Tricepta, I've got 21470 Tricepta, and I've got them on same acres. You're going to be yielding about the same. Which ones do I put my money towards? Well, when you look at it, you're looking at gray leaf spot, southern rest. 21470 is a little weaker on it than 21560. That tells me I'm probably going to, again, if I've got limited budgets, let's go to the one that's probably a little weaker in it.
And most response.
And you're going to get the most response. And like I said, in our Richard's site data, it shows that. I think when I was pulling that information up, we were seeing like 6.5 bushel response on 21560. We're seeing 11.9 bushel response on 21470. And so that's a big key, is getting with your seed supplier and going, okay, these are the acres I'm looking at now. Which of these, from a hybrid standpoint, it's going to give me the best chance of return at that point. And again, it's not to say that 21560 is not something that you couldn't take advantage of, but if it's a limited budget,
Exactly.
focus where you're going to get the best or the highest percent chance of return.
I like to do I appreciate you answering that. I like to do what I call a rapid fire round, and it's kind of a fun little thing to do. Where I'm just going to ask you a few questions here. You don't have to have a big detailed response, but just give me the first thing that comes to your mind. So, one disease that growers underestimate.
Gray leaf spot.
One disease that you feel like growers overreact to.
Common rust.
Yep, that's a good one.
That one I get calls on, and we'll move on. There's other rest to worry about, guys.
Yeah.
The most common mistake that you see growers making with the tassel spray.
Don't necessarily know if it's a mistake, but it's something that shows itself later on in the season is coverage. Biggest thing I can say there is coverage, whether that's the gallonage to it, and also, again, and I would say this goes with airplanes, it goes with drones, it goes with anything, right? Is understanding the abilities of that machinery to cover things equally with it. But the coverage, that's number one, flat out.
That's a good point. Very good point. Biggest myth about corn fungicide.
And we kind of already mentioned this, but that it creates yield. It protects yield, first and foremost.
That's a good one.
All right, as we wrap this up then, Brooke, what's one thing that every grower should know before making a fungicide decision this year on the corn at Tassel?
So for me, first is kind of almost back to what we had talked about, right? Is prioritizing fields a little bit. But again, visit with your seed pro or your seed supplier. Understand the hybrids and the response nature of it. And then probably even just the last caveat of it is, again, watch some of the weather patterns and look ahead. So don't just, again, assume something's going to be the way it's going to be. Take the time. It's a big investment, right? Make sure we're doing it right and with the best ability that we have at the time.
I appreciate that, Brooke, and appreciate you sharing all of your thoughts and perspectives with us today and all of your experiences. And thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Well, I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it.
If there's one thing that I took away from today's discussion is that really the whole thing is a management decision. When we think about the tassel spray, it's a management decision that's based on a lot of different variables. So disease risk, yield potential, even the product selection, as you mentioned, and then ultimately whether it has the chance to generate a return. And so at the end of the day, that's really what this whole podcast is about. It's about taking the information that's available to us, evaluating the economics behind it, and making better decisions on the farm. And so again, thank you for spending some time with us today. And to all of you listening, thanks for listening in and tuning in. I encourage you to, if you found any benefit from this, share this podcast with another grower, another farmer, a neighbor, somebody else that's in the ag industry. We would appreciate that. That helps us continue to grow the brand and support the podcast as we bring this relevant information on a weekly basis. And so again, thank you. Thank you for listening again to another episode of Dirt Dollars and Data. And remember that every decision that we make in the field affects the dirt. It impacts your dollars and should be backed by real data. See you next time.
Dirt, dollars, and data.